Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Last Night on the Titanic podcast series, looking at the lives and the actions of the people who were there on that fateful night. I'm really interested in this episode because we're going to see a side of the Titanic story that people think they know a lot about, but they may or may not be right in that. And I'm joined, as always, with our Titanic expert, Veronica Hinke. Veronica, how are you?
I'm well, Scott. I've been looking really forward to talking with you about the helpers who really, stood up that night, that last night aboard the Titanic.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that, although I don't know a lot about the Titanic, when I'm thinking of historical analogies of people in absolutely desperate situations pushed to the brink of death, the siege at Operation Barbarossa, when Germany nearly toppled Russia west of the Ural Mountains, sieges that are taking place in the Middle Ages when people are starving, absolute desperation. Sometimes you'll hear stories of people who manage to rally and give a little bit of a shred of hope to others. And that's a lot of what these helpers did, whether it's helping people into lifeboats or to motivate people to stay warm, sing songs, whatever it is to keep them from giving up hope when they think that they're going to die. I'm really interested in unpacking this. And I think the first one, I've heard the name, but don't know very much about it at all. The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Great title. That's a great person to start with. So tell us about the unsinkable Molly Brown.
One of my favorite quotes, Scott, is by Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers. He wanted to find a way to show compassion after 9/11, and he shared a story with his viewers. He said that his mother said to him when he was a little boy and there was an emergency situation or there was a disaster, she would say, "Fred, always look for the helpers. You will always find helpers." And that really strengthened him and gave him inspiration and hope for dealing in a crisis situation. And one of the people who stood out in the most remarkable ways was Molly Brown. Molly's name was actually Margaret Brown, and she went by Molly with some folks. And Molly had an incredible story. She was rags to riches. She had married a man who worked in the mines in Colorado. She was known for saying, and her family told me they were, very proud of her values. She said, "I'd rather marry a poor man that I love than a rich man that I didn't." Years later, after the Titanic, in more recent years, a necklace was found at the Titanic wreck site, and it had gold nuggets hanging from it. And people tend to think that that was Molly's necklace because there was probably no other mining wife aboard the Titanic, a wife of a miner. And that necklace was very significant of her life and her life story. She went from having nothing and, working in very menial jobs to help support her family from a very young age and ending up in just a world of nothing but lavish luxuries and just incredible wealth because of the great fortune that her husband struck on and pretty early on in their marriage. And she certainly deserved it from everything I've been able to find out about her. The night of the sinking of the Titanic, she was known for organizing people. She encouraged the women in her lifeboat to row to keep warm. She established, sing-along to help them sing through the night to get through things, to get through the experience. And then once aboard the Carpathia the following morning, in the wee hours of the morning of April 15th, Margaret set to work distributing food, handing out cups of drinks, and passing out blanket after blanket to her fellow survivors. She didn't stop there. As they were afloat in those days when they were heading to New York City, when they'd finally reached New York City, she went with a group of gentlemen to plan a way to recognize Captain Rostron, who was the captain of the Carpathia, and his crew. You have to understand, this was a captain who led the way in the Carpathia through an ice field to go and rescue these people. They took such a risk. So Molly and others decided we need to do something to recognize this incredible crew. They had all sorts of different forms of recognition, and Captain Rostron received an engraved silver cup from them. So there's a photo of them that I was able to find, and it shows them giving him the silver cup. So just when I think of what I would be doing on those days headed in on Carpathia into New York, I cannot imagine the strength this woman had to think, what can I do for others? How can I recognize these people that have rescued us? I mean, it's just incredible.
When I hear stories like that about people, it makes me really curious. Is there something in their background that causes them to rise up to the circumstances? Is it something in the moment that they didn't even know they had the strength for that? And from the little bit that I know of Molly, based on some of the information you've shared with me, she seems to have a very strong joie de vivre. There's some bad French pronunciation for everyone in the audience. She was something of a yodel champion, or she learned how to yodel in Switzerland. Is that right?
She was known as the Rocky Mountain Warbler. She learned how to yodel in Switzerland. And what a neat type of thing to entertain guests with. When she'd have maybe, dinner parties with people, she'd sing and yodel to them afterwards, probably. I can imagine her doing that. And she just really, like you said, a joie de vivre, and you did pronounce that very well. She really had a zest for life. Afterwards, she organized a fund drive for those who would be most in need when they reached New York City. And the Survivors Committee raised nearly $10,000. Her experiences aboard the Titanic really put her in a position where she could do even more for people afterward, and she rose to that challenge. Molly organized an international women's rights conference in Newport, Rhode Island in 1914. So that would have been 2 years after the Titanic. And during World War I, she started a support branch for relief for soldiers in France. She received the French Legion of Honor in 1932 for her bravery during the Titanic disaster and World War I. So it's pretty amazing. And then I was also really impressed at the benevolent work she did, in other ways. She worked with the Committee for the Catholic Fair. She was known at one of the nicest hotels in Denver at the time, and now too, the Brown Palace. The Brown Palace was really helpful to us in research and provided a recipe for a mint cocktail. And it's a really great thing that they did, because we know that a bottle of creme de menthe was found at the wreck site of the Titanic. And so we're happy to have a recipe that honors Molly and also includes a little bit of creme de menthe. She was a teetotaler, but for sure the social functions she was engaged with, there was probably, champagne and creme de menthe drinks and things like that served, at least. So we know that it's definitely a fitting cocktail for this part of the book, and it's included in this section of the book. She was known at the Brown Palace Hotel, Scott, for bringing gifts to the staff, not just the maitre d's and the front desk staff that could help get a good seat or whatnot, but for people, even, the maids, the janitorial staff, everyone would get a gift from her at Christmas time. And she would make sure they had a Christmas tree in the lobby. So she was known, the hotel told me, as having a heart as big as a ham, which they borrowed that from, or I'm not sure what came first, if the movie borrowed that from the Brown Palace Hotel or if the Brown Palace Hotel borrowed it from the movie, but that was how she was described in the movie too. She was, that's where she kind of got her unsinkable Mrs. Brown. That's how she was referred to in her obituary in 1960 when she passed away. in 1932 when she passed away. She was in the Barbizon Hotel in New York City. Of course, the very interesting historic Barbizon Hotel where so many notable people lived at one point in time. The autopsy found that she had a brain tumor. And then in 1960, her story was made into the Broadway musical, The Unsinkable Molly Brown. That's where that comes from.
Does she show up in the two film depictions of the Titanic?
Oh, yes, in both.
Okay, because I've seen the latter one, but it was just kind of a blur, and so I didn't stick out. What was your take on it? Do you think that either one of them or both of them did a good job of the depiction based on what you know about her life?
I do, and I'm happy that, a book is always a great opportunity to take a closer look and provide more details. So I'm glad that we've been able to do that here because there's so much to this woman in addition to that quick glance that you get in those movies. One of the things that I don't think a lot of people know about her is that she invented the canapé or the past appetizer. She was either invented those or she was one of the people who popularized that approach to entertaining at that time. That was, it had to start somewhere, and it was newer back when she was entertaining. She entertained a lot. One of the photos that I was really careful about including in the book is a photo of her with her dinner table before her guests arrive. And it's complete with a candelabra, and she has a damask tablecloth that she loved to decorate with. One of the neat things about Molly is that she invented a wheeled cart for entertaining, and it had a heat component and a cool component. It had silverware drawer or for serving trays. It had compartments for things like that, and even a special area where you could quickly prepare lobster Newburg, which was really popular at the time. She also either invented for the first time or made very popular the buffet style, where you could go through on a buffet and pick things off like we take for granted today. It had to start somewhere, and most people believe that it started with Molly.
Sadly, some parts of her legacy are the Golden Corral buffet. There could also be 4-star breakfast buffets at restaurants. We'll credit the good to her and not the lesser forms of buffets. Something I'm interested in, too, she really does a lot. She's trying to run for a seat in Congress. I'm not even sure if that's legal or not. What were some of the other things that really stuck out to you about her life? She's involved in the suffrage movement. She runs for office. Is there anything else about her life that really sticks out to you?
Well, I think it's really interesting to remember that because she was a woman, Molly was not allowed to testify about the Titanic in the United States Senate hearings about the Titanic. So, she still found ways to fight for people. And even though she had to remain silent at a time like that, I cannot imagine what that must have been like for her, especially since she was such a prolific part of that night and so engaged in helping people survive.
Well, there's a lot of people who are doing things like that, and it would be probably a few books worth to look at all the helpers. Somebody else you focused on was Benjamin Guggenheim, and very wealthy individual, but also plays a key role as the ship is going down. So could you tell me his story?
Molly Brown and Benjamin Guggenheim had worked together in other capacities before the Titanic. The Brown Palace Hotel in Denver told me that they had worked together on a holiday banquet at the Brown Palace. And they had a meal or food to eat for 1,500 of Denver's less fortunate people. So, it's interesting. Here they are on the Titanic together. And then one of the stories, can you hear me okay, Scott?
Yes.
Okay. One of the stories that I came across was when someone came to find Mrs. Guggenheim. He had a message for her, and he told her that Benjamin and his staff, Giglio was his name, the servant, went from lifeboat to lifeboat helping women and children board them. And that was the last he had seen of Mr. Guggenheim, but he wanted his wife to know that he was a gentleman to the last,